The desert air in Arizona carried a silence that made every small sound feel like a gunshot. Gravel crunched under the boots of Jonathan Kay as he stepped out of the bus and into the blistering sun of Mesa Junction, a town small enough to forget, yet large enough to hide everything you didn't want to see. He hadn't told anyone he was coming home. The military-issue duffel bag slung across his shoulders still smelled faintly of sand and metal. His beard was longer than regulation. His skin bore the weight of 2 years in a place he never wanted to remember. But his mind was heavier than the desert sky above. The streets of Mesa Junction hadn't changed. Still one gas station, still that same rusting billboard for cherry pie at Margie's Diner. He passed by it all without seeing. His legs moved on memory. When he saw his house, their house, he stopped. His breath caught. The lawn was still trimmed. The porch swing moved gently in the wind. 2 cars were parked in the driveway. One was hers, a blue Civic. The other was a truck. He knew that truck. It belonged to his younger brother, Mark. For a long moment, he stood still. A bird chirped. Somewhere behind him, a dog barked. But inside him, it was dead quiet. He walked up the steps slowly. His hand hovered above the doorknob. He had a key, but he didn't use it. The door was unlocked. The house smelled like cinnamon and detergent. Home, but not his anymore. He walked down the hallway, every creak of the floorboard a landmine in his chest. Then he heard it. Laughter. 2 voices. One of them hers. He turned the corner and saw them. On the couch, legs tangled like roots. Hannah's head snapped up. Mark's eyes widened, but he didn't speak. No one did. Jonathan didn't shout. He didn't reach for the Glock still stashed in his duffel. He didn't cry. He just looked at them. Looked long and deep like a man staring into the barrel of something he didn't recognize. Then he dropped the keys onto the kitchen counter, turned around, and walked out the front door. The wind was picking up. Somewhere above, the sky was turning copper with evening. He didn't go to a motel. He went to Ben Harper's trailer on the edge of town. Ben was a childhood friend, now a mechanic and sometime drifter who owed Jonathan more than one favor. "You look like hell," Ben said, handing him a beer. "I've seen worse." They didn't talk about the war, or about Hannah, or Mark. That night, Jonathan lay awake on the torn couch, staring at the tin ceiling. His fingers curled around the knife hidden under the pillow, just in case. Sleep came in fits. Dreams were a mess of dirt roads and distant screams. When he woke, the sun was already high. Outside, someone was knocking on the trailer door. It was a woman in sunglasses and a pantsuit, sleek, calculated, the kind of smile that came with contracts. "Sue Long," she said. "Hannah mentioned you might want to sell the house." He stared at her like she'd spoken in static. "No." Then, "Yes." He signed the papers 3 hours later. No haggling, no questions, just a signature. That evening, he stood across the street from the house. Lights were on. Shadows moved behind the curtains. A family scene. A new story written over his old one. He didn't belong in any of it. When he left, he didn't look back. He had 1 tank of gas, $400 in cash, and no destination. But the desert was calling. And somewhere in that endless expanse of dust and silence, he hoped to find something cleaner than revenge. Maybe even peace. Jonathan drove out of town with the windows down and the radio off. The wind slapped at his face, hot and dry like a warning. Every mile he put behind him felt like an unraveling. Threads of a life pulled loose from the seams. The truck he drove was borrowed, technically. Ben had handed over the keys that morning without asking where he was going. Just a nod. That was enough. On the passenger seat sat a leather-bound notebook, blank except for one name written on the first page in a neat, deliberate hand. Mark. The highway stretched out ahead like a scar. He didn't know where it ended, and for once, he didn't care. It was just after midday when he stopped for gas at a station near the edge of the Mojave. A cracked sign welcomed him to a place called Silver Flat. The attendant was a kid no older than 20, chewing gum and scrolling on a phone. Jonathan stepped inside to grab a bottle of water. The store was empty, save for an elderly woman behind the register and a dusty rack of postcards no one had touched in a decade. "You military?" the woman asked, glancing at his boots. "Used to be," he said, unscrewing the bottle cap. "You've got that look," she said. "The ones who come back different." Jonathan didn't answer. He paid in cash and walked out. By nightfall, he was parked off a dirt road surrounded by mesquite and stone. No city lights, no voices, no past. He unrolled a sleeping bag in the bed of the truck, lay on his back, and stared at the stars. The desert sky was so wide, it made him feel smaller than he had since the war. Sometime around midnight, a sound stirred him, a light crunch of gravel. He reached for the knife beside him, silent, eyes sharp. A silhouette moved near the brush. Human. Alone. Jonathan sat up slowly. "Easy," said the figure. "Just passing through." It was a young man in his mid-20s, a travel pack slung over one shoulder, and a road-weary look in his eyes. "My name's Thomas," he said. "Been walking since Barstow. You mind if I crash near the truck? Just for the night." Jonathan didn't like strangers, but something in Thomas's voice lacked threat. It was more like a man who had been worn down to the edge. "Stay on that side," Jonathan said, nodding toward the far end of the truck bed. "No sudden moves." Thomas gave a tight smile. "Wouldn't dream of it." In the morning, they drove together in silence for a while. Thomas didn't ask many questions. Jonathan didn't offer answers. But the stillness between them wasn't tense. It was the kind men carried after too many goodbyes. "You ever lose everything at once?" Thomas asked sometime after noon. Jonathan didn't look at him. "I thought I did." "Turns out," Thomas said, "you can always lose more." They stopped for food in a town with no name on the map. Just a handful of trailers and a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Cora's Kitchen." Inside, the air was thick with grease and ghosts. A man at the bar watched them as they ate. Late 40s, rough hands, eyes like gravel. He didn't speak, but his stare lingered too long. Jonathan noticed. So did Thomas. As they left, the man followed them outside. Jonathan turned before the man could speak. "Something you need?" The man shrugged. "Just curious where you're headed." "Nowhere," Jonathan said. The man nodded once. "Best place to go these days." He turned and walked away. Thomas watched him until he disappeared behind the diner. "You know him?" he asked. "No," Jonathan said. "But he knew me." That night, camped under the cracked hull of an old water tower, Thomas spoke again. "I think someone's following us." Jonathan didn't answer right away. He'd felt it too. The unease, the eyes in the dark. Not the kind you imagined. The kind you knew were real. "Could be," he said. "Why?" Thomas asked. "You dragging something behind you?" Jonathan stared into the fire they'd built. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe it's not just me." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, "You ever kill a man who trusted you?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said, "but not for the reason he thought." In the early hours, Jonathan woke to find Thomas sitting a few feet away, holding Jonathan's knife. He didn't flinch, didn't move. "Just wanted to see what kind of edge it had," Thomas said. Jonathan held his gaze. "Put it back," he said. Thomas did, but the tension didn't leave. Jonathan knew now. This wasn't just a hitchhiker. This was something else, and the road ahead wasn't going to be quiet much longer. The desert had a way of burning away illusions. Heat shimmered off the asphalt like ghosts of choices not taken, and the silence between Jonathan and Thomas grew denser with every passing mile. They had crossed into Nevada without ceremony, just a faded sign and a road that wound deeper into nowhere. Jonathan barely spoke. He kept one hand on the wheel and both eyes on the mirrors. By the third day together, the air in the cab felt heavier than the heat. They stopped in a one-bar town called Fallon Creek. It had a population of maybe 20, 2 of whom worked at the gas station/liquor store. Jonathan went in alone while Thomas stayed with the truck. Inside, the shelves were half empty. The man behind the counter wore a tank top and mirrored sunglasses, indoors. Jonathan grabbed canned beans, bottled water, and a road map, even though he didn't need one. When he placed the items on the counter, the man looked him over. "You headed north?" the man asked. "Just passing through." "You and your friend, Army?" Jonathan didn't answer. The man smiled without humor. "Place you're going, you won't need maps." Jonathan paid in silence. As he stepped outside, he saw it again. Movement near the edge of the lot. A figure, too far to make out, slipped behind a building the moment Jonathan turned. He scanned the area, but no one else emerged. When he got back in the truck, he handed Thomas a bottle of water. "We need to move, now." Thomas didn't ask why. That night, They camped at the base of a ridge under a sky littered with stars. A coyote howled in the distance, long, mournful, like it knew something the men didn't. Thomas sat across from the fire, sharpening a branch with a pocket knife. Sparks popped and cracked, little explosions in the stillness. "You ever think about where you're going?" Thomas asked. "Or are you just running from wherever you've been?" Jonathan considered the question. The fire danced in his eyes. "I don't think there's a difference anymore." Thomas nodded like he understood. "I used to have a map in my head, had a plan, but every road I took bent somewhere wrong." "Then make a new one," Jonathan said. Thomas laughed. "Maybe I'm just waiting for the end of the road." Jonathan didn't reply. He was thinking of something his platoon leader once told him. Some men die in battle, some don't die until years after. The next morning they reached the place. It wasn't marked on any official map, but Jonathan remembered it from his childhood. An old geologist camp turned ghost site near an abandoned copper mine. The wind came down through the rocks like whispers. The buildings were gone, but the foundations remained. Concrete slabs, rusted metal poles, and one half-buried trailer that leaned at a sharp angle. "This is it?" Thomas asked. Jonathan climbed out of the truck, stretched and nodded. "My father brought me here when I was 10, said it was the edge of the world." Thomas looked around. "It still is." They explored the area in silence. Inside the trailer, Jonathan found an old metal locker wedged shut. With effort, he pried it open, and inside, wrapped in dry plastic, was a folder of photographs and maps. He flipped through the papers. Most were meaningless, survey notes, measurements. But one photo made him freeze. It was from the war. Taken in the field. A shot of his unit at an outpost in the Kandahar Mountains. He was in the photo. So was Lieutenant Maddox. And so was a third man, a local arms dealer named Kazim, marked for death months before the picture was supposedly taken. That photo never should have existed. "What is it?" Thomas asked. Jonathan handed him the photo. "This was taken after Kazim was already dead, and this," he pointed to a scribble on the back, "is a U.S. military serial code." Thomas whistled low. "You think someone was laundering intel through this place?" "I think someone used this town, this ground, as a dead drop, and they used my unit to do it." That night the fire burned low. "You said back on the road that you'd been betrayed," Jonathan said. "By who?" Thomas stared into the flames. "My brother," he said at last, "stole everything, framed me, left me with a record and a debt to men you don't repay." Jonathan's voice was quiet. "So now you run?" "I run until I find the right place to stop." Jonathan looked out into the black beyond the firelight. "You just did." They were woken at dawn by the sound of an engine. Low, steady, approaching slow. Jonathan was up in seconds, rifle in hand, crouched low behind the trailer. A black SUV came into view, kicking dust. Its windows were tinted. The engine cut off. Two men stepped out, armed, moving like they'd done this before. Jonathan signaled to Thomas silently. Thomas nodded and flanked right, circling around through the brush. One of the men called out, "Mr. K, we're not here to cause trouble." Jonathan didn't answer. "We're just here to clean up something you found, the kind of thing that's better left buried." The second man added, "You hand over the folder, we all walk away." Jonathan said nothing. Then he moved. A shot cracked through the still morning air. The shot hit the trailer with a metallic scream, sending flakes of rust flying. Jonathan rolled behind a crumbled concrete block, dirt biting into his elbows. The folder was tucked under his jacket. He hadn't let go of it since he found the photo. Another shot rang out, closer. Then silence. "Come on out, Kay," the voice called again. "You know this isn't personal. You just wandered somewhere you don't belong." Jonathan leaned out for a split second, caught sight of the two men fanning out. Tactical, clean, professional, not small time. These weren't freelancers. These were the kind of men who didn't ask why they were sent, only how much they'd get paid. He crept along the edge of the ruins, circling behind a collapsed solar tower. From there he spotted Thomas, low in the brush, 30 feet out, eyes locked on the target. Jonathan gave the slightest nod. The two strangers moved forward, sweeping their weapons from side to side. One moved too far from the other. Bad formation. Jonathan took his shot. The first man dropped, not dead, but screaming, wound to the thigh. The other spun, returning fire blindly. Thomas darted from the brush, tackling him with sudden violence. The fight was quick, brutal. Thomas wasn't just some drifter. He moved like someone who had once known the inside of a prison yard or something worse. After the dust settled, the second man lay unconscious. The wounded one bled into the dirt, gasping. Jonathan crouched beside him. "Who sent you?" The man coughed, red blooming across his lips. "You already know." "Say it." The man's eyes fluttered. "Carl." Jonathan's fists clenched. Carl Hensley. The same name that had followed him since Kandahar. The same arms broker who had once offered him a bribe to look the other way during a convoy. The same man Hannah had once called just a friend who helped us refinance the mortgage. It was never about the house. It was never about Mark. That had just been the noise. Carl was the signal. By midday, they'd buried the dead man under a cairn of rocks and tied the unconscious one to a metal post in the shade. They took his phone and gear, dumped the SUV into a dry creek bed, and covered it with brush. "You think he'll talk when he wakes up?" Thomas asked. "He doesn't have to," Jonathan said, holding up the phone. "I just need the right number." Thomas looked at him with something new in his eyes. Not just caution, but respect. "You've done this before," he said. Jonathan didn't answer. He had. That night they sat beside the fire again. This time closer together, backs toward the canyon, eyes outward. There was no illusion of safety anymore. Thomas ran his hands through his hair. "So what now? You call Carl and what? Invite him out for coffee?" Jonathan watched the flames twist. "No. I sent him a message." He scrawled something on the back of the photo of his unit. Then he took a shot of it with the dead man's phone and sent it to the last contact on the list, marked only as C. Seconds later, the phone pinged with a reply. "You shouldn't have come home." Thomas leaned over his shoulder. "Well, that's friendly." By dawn, the tied man was gone. Rope cut clean. No sign of struggle. No trail. "He had help," Jonathan said. Thomas checked the ridge. "They're circling." They moved out within the hour, heading northwest into rougher terrain. Jonathan's plan wasn't to run. It was to draw Carl in, force him to reveal how deep the roots went. The farther they got from town, the closer they were getting to the truth. They set up in an old weather station clinging to the edge of a mesa. There, they laid out everything they knew. Photos, coordinates, maps, fragments of names. The evidence pointed to one thing. Carl had used his family's small-town respectability as a front for arms trafficking. And when the military pulled out, he'd started using American soldiers as pawns in an international smuggling network. And someone in Jonathan's unit had helped him. Maddox? Hannah? Jonathan's stomach turned. That evening, Thomas handed him a small, sealed envelope. "Found it inside that locker. Had your name on it." Jonathan opened it with steady hands. Inside was a note, handwritten. "If you're reading this, it means the fire followed you home. Carl never forgives. You think the war ended when you flew home, but it never did. This place is the only map that matters. Tell Mark I'm sorry." The signature was a single letter. M. Maddox. Jonathan stared into the fading light, jaw clenched. "I think my brother knew." Thomas raised a brow. "Knew what?" "That Carl was watching me, that something was wrong. Maybe he didn't know everything, but enough." He didn't say it, but the thought burned through him like acid. Maybe Hannah had just tried to survive it the only way she knew how, by siding with the man who promised to protect her, even if that man was his own brother. At midnight the storm came, wind whipping over the ridge, lightning in the distance. The desert smelled of metal and dust, and out of the dark came a sound. Engines. Multiple. They were out of time. Jonathan looked at Thomas. "We finish this here." Thomas just nodded and chambered around. The fire between them flared and died. The engines stopped just out of sight. 2, maybe 3 vehicles, judging by the gravel crunch and the flicker of headlights against canyon stone. Jonathan and Thomas were already in position, crouched behind the reinforced shell of the weather station, rifles steady, nerves like coiled wire. The moon had slipped behind a veil of clouds, casting everything in a silver-gray uncertainty. The only light came from the faint glow of the approaching men's flashlights. 3 beams, sweeping left to right. "Stay low," Jonathan whispered. "Let them come close." Thomas nodded, eyes narrowed. His breathing had slowed to a predator's rhythm. Then came the voice. Calm. Familiar. sharp as a scalpel. "Jonathan K." Carl Hensley. "You were always the loyal type," Carl called out. "Even when you knew things didn't add up. Even when Maddox started asking questions. You knew, didn't you? Deep down." Jonathan didn't answer. His finger hovered near the trigger. "I admired that about you," Carl continued. "You never broke, even when they died. Even when your own brother took the deal just to protect your pretty wife." That one cut deep. Jonathan's muscles tensed. Thomas noticed. "He's trying to make you move." "I know," Jonathan whispered. Then Carl's voice changed, went quiet, colder. "You have something that belongs to me. Give me the folder, and I'll make sure your name disappears from every database I have access to. No more chasers, no more dead men. You and your friend can vanish." Jonathan stood slowly. "I don't want to vanish," he said into the dark. "I want you to be seen." Silence. Then a sharp, wet laugh from Carl. "Well then," he said, "I guess this is the part where you die for your principles." The firefight erupted like thunder cracking dry earth. Automatic fire stitched the side of the station. Glass shattered. Dirt flew. Jonathan dropped flat, returned 3 rounds in quick succession. 1 hit, maybe 2. Thomas moved like smoke, flanking right behind a dune, firing controlled bursts that kept the attackers pinned. 1 man broke cover too soon. Jonathan shot him clean through the shoulder. He crumpled with a howl. Then a shadow moved to the left. Too fast, too close. Jonathan pivoted, fired point blank. The man dropped at his feet. Breathing hard, Jonathan ducked behind a pile of stone, bullets whining past his head like angry bees. Thomas called out over the gunfire. "2 left! Carl and 1 more! Keep the pressure! Force them into the open!" Jonathan shouted back. He reloaded, counted his remaining rounds. Not enough for a long battle. Time to end it. He moved low and fast, crawling through an old drainage trench toward the parked trucks. One of them still had its headlights on. He could use that. From this new vantage point, he spotted Carl behind a boulder, speaking rapidly into a satellite phone. Jonathan leveled his rifle. "1 move," he said, "and you lose your tongue before your secrets." Carl froze, phone still in hand. "Well," he said, not even flinching, "took you long enough." Jonathan emerged from cover, weapon raised. "Drop it." Carl let the phone fall. "You think this ends here?" he said. "You think I'm the top of this pyramid?" "No," Jonathan said, "but you're the part I can reach." Just then, a gun clicked behind him. Jonathan turned too slowly. A 4th man, hidden till now, had snuck up behind him, weapon drawn. But before the man could fire, a shot rang out. Clean, sharp. The man's chest bloomed red. Thomas stood behind him, rifle steady. "Nice timing," Jonathan muttered, exhaling. Thomas gave a dry smile. "You were blocking the shot." They zip-tied Carl and threw him to the ground. For the first time, the man looked afraid. "You have no idea what you've done," he hissed. "There are people watching. People who don't forgive." Jonathan knelt beside him. "Then let them watch." He pulled the folder from his jacket and lit a flare. One by one, he laid the documents out on the sand. Photographs, coordinates, names, dates, truth, in black and white. Then he photographed each page with Carl's phone, uploaded them using the emergency uplink from the weather station's comm tower. Still active, still connected to the satellite network. The images were sent to 4 places. A trusted contact from his army days, a journalist in Seattle, a war crimes archive, and, most importantly, his own anonymous dead drop server. Let the story go viral. Let the files fall into public hands. "Now everyone knows," he said. They left Carl behind, tied to the truck with enough water to make it through the night. Barely. Jonathan didn't care if he lived or died. Let nature decide. The sun rose slowly over the Nevada desert, casting long golden lines across the rocks. The sky was clear again. In the stillness of the new day, Thomas finally spoke. "So what now?" Jonathan looked at the endless road ahead, the desert stretching like a blank page. "I go further," he said. "Someplace no one will find me. No noise, no ghosts." Thomas nodded. "I think I'll come with you, if that's all right." Jonathan thought about it. "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." But as they drove north into the empty places, a thought lingered in Jonathan's mind like a slow-burning match. Carl said Mark took the deal to protect Hannah. That meant she was in danger too, and the war still wasn't over. Not yet. They reached the Utah border just before dusk. The truck, weathered, rattling, and streaked with dust, seemed to groan under the weight of everything it had carried: supplies, weapons, 2 men with nowhere left to go, and a past that refused to die quietly. Jonathan hadn't spoken much since they left Carl in the desert. Thomas gave him space. He'd learned enough about Jonathan to understand that silence wasn't absence. It was precision, focus, calculation. And right now, Jonathan was calculating something dangerous. That night, they camped beneath a broken rock arch, the moon casting silver light through its jagged eye. The fire between them was small, just enough heat to keep the desert's chill from settling into their bones. Jonathan stared into the flames for a long time before finally speaking. "I need to go back," he said. Thomas didn't look surprised. "You think Carl was telling the truth?" Jonathan nodded. "If Mark made a deal to protect her, that means she was a target. Maybe still is. Maybe they both are. You still care about her?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. "It's not about love," he said. "It's about debt." Thomas poked at the fire. "And what do you owe her?" "A chance to choose, not survive." They drove through the night, back toward Mesa Junction. This time the road felt heavier, tighter, as if the land itself knew they were looping back to something that refused to stay buried. When they reached the outskirts, dawn was bleeding over the horizon. The town was just waking up, its gas stations blinking to life, its early risers stumbling into diners. Jonathan parked 3 blocks from his old house. He and Thomas walked the rest of the way. The house looked different in the morning light. Smaller, cleaner, but not safer. Jonathan scanned the street. No obvious tails, no parked black SUVs. But that didn't mean anything. He knocked once, firmly. It was Mark who answered. For a full second, neither man spoke. Then Mark exhaled. "Jesus, John. We thought—" "Where's Hannah?" Mark stepped aside. She was in the kitchen, wearing one of Jonathan's old flannel shirts, hair tied up, hands trembling as she set down a cup of coffee she hadn't yet tasted. She looked up, and for a second something flashed in her eyes. Relief, guilt, fear, maybe all 3. "Are you here to kill us?" she asked. "No," Jonathan said. "I'm here to tell you what's coming." They sat together around the small table, the same one they used to eat at during better years. Jonathan laid it all out. The dead soldiers, the photos, Carl, the documents now loose in the world. The message was clear. This wasn't about betrayal anymore. This was fallout. "Carl said you were protected," he told Mark. "That you took a deal." Mark didn't deny it. He looked down at his hands. "I didn't know how deep it went," he said. "I just knew they were watching her. They showed me pictures. Her at work, at the grocery store. They said if I helped them, they'd make her disappear quietly, not violently." Hannah's face was pale. "You didn't tell me." Mark met her eyes. "I was trying to protect you." She stood, shaking. "You sold me." "No," Jonathan said. "He gambled you. Different sin. Same cost." They had 1 hour before they had to leave. Jonathan knew that once the files went public, Carl's superiors would sweep clean the mess, quietly, efficiently. That meant anyone tied to the operation was now a liability. They packed bags. Thomas stood watch by the window. 2 men, black SUV, he said. "East side." Jonathan nodded. "That's our cue." They moved fast. Out the back, through the alley, into a borrowed car Thomas had stolen earlier that morning just in case. As they pulled onto the main road, the SUV turned the corner too late. They drove east, toward the Canyonlands, a place Thomas knew. Old ranger territory, carved into stone, unreachable without knowledge of the terrain. There, they would split. Thomas would disappear south. He had contacts near the border, people who owed him. Jonathan would go farther, into the desert proper, off the grid, off the map. Mark and Hannah? They would be ghosts now. New names, new identities. Paid for with cash and whatever connections Jonathan had left. But none of them would sleep easily again. 2 days later, Thomas stood at a gas station in New Mexico, watching as news trickled in on a dusty television bolted above the register. Leaked files link private contractors to international arms deal scandal. Whistleblower evidence prompts Pentagon inquiry. FBI declines to comment. Thomas smiled grimly. It had worked. At least part of it. He stepped outside and looked east. Nothing but sand and sun. He whispered, "Good luck, brother." Jonathan stood alone in a stretch of barren land miles from any road. The sun was setting behind him, the sky painted in blood and gold. Around him, silence, pure and final. He hadn't spoken in hours. He didn't need to. The war was over. Not the one he fought overseas, the one he brought home, the one inside him. Now, with nothing left to lose and no one left to save, he let the desert take him, one step at a time, deeper into the land of mirages and ghosts. A soldier again, but finally his own.